Ford will tell you the Boss 429 was a production Mustang. That statement is technically true, but it's also incredibly misleading. Because this car was never actually built by Ford in the way people imagine, it barely met street legal requirements. And the only reason it exists at all is because Ford needed a loophole. Fast. This isn't the story of a muscle car designed for the street. This is the story of how Ford bent the rules just far enough to win on the racetrack, then quietly walked away before anyone asked too many questions. This is the Boss 429 Mustang that was never really supposed to exist. By the late 1960s, American manufacturers were locked in a full-scale horsepower war. Racing wasn't marketing, it was the brand. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi, and in NASCAR, the Hemi was a problem. It made power, it survived long races, and it was humiliating Ford on the track. Ford needed an answer. Not in 5 years, not in the next body style. Immediately. So Ford engineers designed an engine with one purpose: to beat Chrysler's Hemi at high speed. That engine became the 429 hemispherical V8, later known as the Boss 429. But NASCAR had a rule. If you wanted to race an engine, you had to sell it to the public. 500 street cars, no exceptions. And that's where everything went sideways. The Boss 429 was never designed with the Mustang in mind. It was huge, wider than anything Ford had put in production car. The shock towers were in the way, the suspension geometry just didn't work. On Ford's own assembly line, the engine simply would not fit. There was no quick fix, no bolt-on solutions, so Ford faced a choice. Redesign the Mustang, impossible on the timeline, or build the cars somewhere else. Ford chose option 2. This is the part most people don't fully understand. Ford did not assemble Boss 429 Mustangs the way they assembled other cars. Instead, partially completed Mustangs rolled off Ford's line without engines installed. Those unfinished cars were then shipped to an outside contractor called CarCraft. CarCraft's job was to do what Ford couldn't. They cut into the engine bay, modified the shock towers, reworked the front suspension, and hand-fitted each Boss 429 engine. These were not assembly line cars. They were effectively hand-built conversions approved and paid for by Ford. Only after CarCraft finished the work were the cars considered complete. So when people say Ford built the Boss 429, the truth is a lot more complicated. Ford approved it, Ford paid for it, but Ford couldn't physically build it themselves. On paper, Boss 429s are Mustangs. The VINs say Mustang, dealer invoices say Mustang, registrations say Mustang. But the assembly line never installed the engine. There are CarCraft tags, unique subframes, non-standard suspension components, and Ford never tracked many of the details collectors obsess over today. The seat types, interior configurations, and minor option combinations. Ford tracked engine and transmission totals because NASCAR required that. Everything else? It wasn't important enough to document. That's why Boss 429 paperwork is messy. That's why restoration sparked debates. And that's why some cars are questioned even today. On paper, they are production cars. In reality, they exist in a gray area between factory build and sanctioned custom. Ford rated the Boss 429 at 375 horsepower. Almost nobody believes that number, by the way. In reality, the engine was closer to 500 horsepower in factory trim. But to sell the car, Ford had to make compromises. Cam timing softened, compression reduced, exhaust restricted. Even then, the car was difficult. It overheated in traffic, it hated low-speed driving, it required constant tuning. Dealers knew this. Many quietly fixed issues before customers ever even took delivery. Cooling problems, idle issues, drivability quirks. Because these cars weren't built to be driven to work, they were built to satisfy a rule book. Unlike Chrysler, Ford never leaned heavily into the Boss 429 legend. No massive advertising push, no long-term performance branding. Why? Because Ford knew exactly what the Boss 429 was. A loophole. A liability. A car that existed only because the rules temporarily allowed it. Once NASCAR rules changed, the Boss 429 disappeared. No successor, no evolution, no attempt to refine it. Ford just quietly moved on. And in many ways, that silence tells you everything you need to know. The Boss 429 isn't rare because it was glamorous. It's rare because it was inconvenient. Too big, too expensive, and too impractical. It existed to win, not to sell. And once it served that purpose, Ford just let it go. That doesn't make it less important. It makes it one of the most honest muscle cars ever built. The Boss 429 is not a myth. It's a factory-approved workaround, and one of the boldest ones Detroit ever pulled off. If you're into the real history of muscle cars, the stories manufacturers don't like to talk about, subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments, do you consider the Boss 429 a true factory Mustang? Or do you say it's a sanctioned custom built to beat the rules? Let me know. See you next time.